Welcome to the fastest daf in town. Today we'll select this Bava Batra daf Lamed Zayin. We're going to begin on the bottom of Lamed Vav Amid Beis, quoting the words of the Mishnah, Rabbi Shmuel b'mediv amor b'stei halavan. So this goes all the way back to the beginning of our parak on Daf Chav Ches that discussed that typically we have to have 3 years for a field. However, we also made a distinction between the shitas of Rabbi Akiva, who said you only have to plant for 1 month, and then 12, then 1 month, which we said is 14 total, or according to Rabbi Shmuel, who says 3 months, 1 year, and 3 months, which ends up being 18 months total. But then the Mishnah said, wait, that only applies to a stay lavan, that you would have 18 months. A stay lavan, the Rashbam on the Mishnah said, Shikol Peroseha Nilkatin Beperk Echad. They're all gathered at the same time, so therefore you need this period of 3 years. However, concludes the Mishnah, Abastei Elon, when it comes to produce that comes from trees, Kanas as Tivwaso, Masaka Zesav, Kanas as Kaitso, El Gimel Shanim. So it's not necessary for you to actually have 3 years. It's enough that you actually harvest 3 crops. If you take the grapes from the vine or olives, the figs, if you take these 3 different crops that grow at different times, so that's ki'ilu, like your 3 years. So on this, Omer Abaye, mid Rabbi Shmuel, based on the words of Rabbi Shmuel, Nishmel Rabbanon, we can understand the shita of the Rabbanon. What exactly does that mean? So let's first go right into the Rashbam. Halchi Garsinan. B'halchi Pirusha, Rabbi Shmuel, the Bishan Achas Havi Chazaka. As we established above, that even having 1 year, it's possible you can have a Chazaka, B'sada Achas B'shol Shakitais, B'shol Shemikomos B'sada. That as long as you're gathering up 3 different crops in the field, and they're obviously coming from different places because they're growing in different areas in your same field. After all, it says, Kanas says, Tivwaso Masaka Zesav, so Medavarav Nishmahu Rabbanan de Pligale. It sounds like they argue in Uboy Gimel Shanim that they actually require 3 years. So the Leika Plukta ben Rabbi Shmuel ben Rabbanan El B'Shana Achas v'Gimel Shanim. Sounds like the whole machlok is between 1 and 3 years. V'Kolma dikam Rabbi Shmuel B'Shana Achas am Rabbanan v'Gimel Shanim. That whatever works for Rabbi Shmuel for 1 year should work for the Rabbanan for 3 years. And therefore, because of that, says the Gemara, Hayu lo shloishim ilonais mi mata asar lebeisa. Let's say you have 30 trees, and they were planted 10 of them in a base saw. Says the Rashbam, the base saw sarach le'esen netiyos. We know that that's brought down the Halach Moshe Sinai, that you need to have 10 trees that are strategically planted far from each other within a distance of a base saw field. Says the Rashbam, as we mentioned in the second parak in this Masechta, when pachis me base saw yud ilonos hari smuchin b'yoser, they're too close. Bavi kiyar, it's like a forest. Dol avi chazaka, dol aksik and maxi inchi, they're too crowded. If yoser me base saw linami lihavi chazaka liyud, if you have 10 trees which are more spread out, that also doesn't work because you're not really using the land efficiently. El keneged mashasar chilonos. You only get keneged the ilonos and not the whole field. Okay. So, again, let's say you have shloishim ilonos memato asar ubeisa, and you planted the amount within the proximity of 10 trees in a beisa. Achol sar b'shana zu v'asar b'shana zu v'asar b'shana zu harizu chazaka. So you have 30 trees, but you are able to eat from 10 of them in 1 year, 10 another, 10 in another. So even though you haven't actually used the entire field each year, but since you ended up using 10 in one year, 10 in the other, 10 in the other, that constitutes the ownership of the entire field. As we continue to Lamed Zayin Amud Aleph, how do we see this? Because Lav Miyam Rabbi Shmuel, didn't Rabbi Shmuel say that Chad Peri Havi Chazakal Kulu Peri, that it's as though because it's in the same orchard, it's in the same field. So if you gathered up, as we saw in the Mishnah, the grapes or the figs or whatever it may be, even though you have this huge field, but you're only taking crops for one area during different seasons, so that taking of one crop in one area constitutes a chazakah for the entire field. It's not that you just are kind of certain areas, but you're kind of the whole thing. So too, hachinami havi hani havi chazakah lahani v'hani havi chazakah lahani. So therefore, the din is also, it will be a chazakah here too. Even though all you did was eat from 10 trees, 10, 10, so it's a field that has 30. The reality is that since you were able to gather from the trees that grew, the fruits that grew on that time, those 10 trees, it's a chazakah for everything. So therefore, you would still need, of course, according to the Rabbanim, 3 years, but it's not necessary that you actually have to operate and work the entire field the entire time. So on this, the Gemara explains a little bit more. And this is what the Rashbam says on the top: the b'makam hazesim mahani l'makam hatvua v'kayitz ukil hichsek b'shlosh dami. So even though you only were using one part of the field, but it works for the whole field. However, there's two parameters here. V'hani mili heicha delo apiku. That's only if the other 20 trees weren't producing. Aval apiku v'loi achal. So the Rashbam says the lo apik achrini, if they're kia esrim lo osru peros ki'im asar lavad. So why do we say that you eating from 10 trees on year 1 is enough, 10 from another tree is good, and then the third 10 on the third year is enough? That's only because those other 20 trees weren't producing fruit. But if they were just sitting there and rotting on the vines, that's not the way an owner would ever act. He would obviously be harvesting everything. So the fact that you only took from 10, that is not a chazakah. However, again, as we're saying in our Gemara, if in fact those other trees did not produce, so the chiddush is, according to the Rabbanan, even though you need 3 years, but the fact that you took 10 trees and you ate from those 10 trees, and those are the only ones that were producing fruit at year 1, so therefore it's a chazakah for all of the other part of the field. And furthermore, v'hu debazi bazuze, which we elaborated as well before, that they need to be spread out, these trees. Says Rashi, v'hani mili dehavi chazakah kisha'achal asara b'chol shana, that when you ate these from these 10 trees, hainu alidi pizor, that they were properly spread out. Shachal gimel b'chol beisa, denimsa machzik kol asada, that you're considered, if it's the trees are all planted in the proper way, that's how it's a chazakah. Of achal yudi lanos b'yachad, but let's say, and you ate some of the trees that were spread all over the place, but if you ate 10 trees in which they were all clustered, so why do we say So he explains that we're not talking about a field of a beisah. It has to be, as we saw already, that those 10 trees are spread out in a beisah. But let's say your field is 3 saw, so 3 sosayim, if you will. So in that situation, that is enough to sustain the 30 trees, and they are all spread out properly. But the chiddush is that the only way that you could acquire this base saw and this base saw and this base saw is if those 10 trees were not all clustered together in one area of the field, but some of the trees that grew and you ate on year 1 were on the right side, some on the other side of the field, and therefore that shows that you are not only eating the fruits that are able to be eaten, which was only 10 on year 1 and subsequently 10 the next year, etc., but also that it shows that you have ownership of the entire field because you were using the entire field. Okay, let's look at question 5. So as we said, Shlo Hotziu Peros B'chol Shana, Elo Hasar Levadam, Ha'esrim Lo Hotziu Peros. It has to be the other 20 trees did not bear fruit during that time. And Shahayu Hasar Ilanu Shachal, the 10 trees who ate, B'chol Shana Mefuzarim, B'chol Gimel Bate Sa. They had to be spread out properly. Okay, let's see question TB 22. So exactly the same question as question 5. This is Lamed Zayin Amud Aleph, TB 22. So this is what I wrote. Kasher kites, it says haperis, when you harvest the fruits, miyud ilanos, from the 10 trees, in peiros al hachi, rak al ilanos halalu. Okay, so basically there's no fruit on the other trees. The sarich hashloishim ilanos al kol beisa velo b'makoy meyuchad velo mishtamish es kol beisa. Okay, basically what I was trying to get at, as I said, is that you have to you eat from some of these trees which are all spread out. Let's look at question TA21. Be'eza oifen machar gimel ilanos. Okay, we didn't get to that yet. All right, let's continue. So the Gemara says like this: Zeh hichsik bilanos, v'zeh hichsik bekarka. Rav Zid, zeh kaine ilanos, v'zeh kaine karka. So let's go straight into the Rashbam. What exactly is going on over here? So Rashbam says, Shnei lukuchos. You have 2 purchasers, shlochu stei ilan. They purchased a field with trees, me'adam echad biyachad, and they purchased it at the exact same time. Now, le'echad machar kark, le'echad machar ilanos. So I owned a field, and I sold one person the land, and I also sold at the same time a different person the trees that were on that land. So this is what it's referring to. So the Rashbam says, the karka nikna b'kesem shtar b'chazaka. We know that karka is brought down in Kedushin. You can acquire it through kesef shtar chazaka. V'la b'cheses gimel shanim mayri. This is actually not talking about cheses gimel shanim at all. We're talking about just stam kinyanim. So Reb Zvid said, zeh kani ilanos leperoi sehen b'loi karka. So the Rashbam explains that he acquires the trees for the fruit, but he does not acquire the land. So what does that matter? You own the trees. So the Rashbam points out, what happens if the trees die? He's not allowed to replant because he doesn't own the land. He's only allowed to use the trees while they're still functioning. But once those trees die, you can't replant them because he doesn't own the land. The other guy does. Even if this person purchased 3 trees, the owner of the land owns everything, and the owner of the tree does not own any of the land. Now, we're going to see later on, as the Rashbam quotes, the kanakarka tachteim uvnehem v'chutzalehen kamoi orvitsaloi. The truth is, when a person purchases land, you own also let's say a tree. You should be able to own a little bit of the land in its proximity, like the amount that you can stand there, you can put your basket on the ground. So you should own a little bit of this land. But says the Rashbam, that's only in a situation where I own the land and the trees, and I sell you only to one person this. Then you have certain rights to a certain amount of land. Here, as the Rashbam reiterates, we're talking about 2 buyers. Each person bought different things. So the one who bought the trees can say to the one who owned the land could say to the owner of the trees, just like I have no rights to your trees, you also have no right to the land. So therefore, again, according to Rav Zvid, the point is that once those trees die, the owner of the trees cannot replant on that land because that land was already sold. But again, that's because Davka, the situation that there's two lekuchos. So that's the din of Rav Zvid. Zekana ilanos is zekana karka. That's what that line means. So Maskabra Papa back in the Gemara. Im kain the enu bal ilanos bekarka klum. You're basically saying the owner of the trees has no right to the land. So lamely bal karka bal ilanos akar ilanach shakal bazil. It sounds like he can just basically go up to him and say, remove them, which seems illogical, which is really what Razvid is saying. It says the Rashbam, Kishiyavish Ilan, not obviously now, when the trees are good, but once the trees dry out, he should be able to say, remove them, get rid of this. Avol Kolzman Shu Tayin Pears, says the Rashbam, as long as they're producing fruit. Obviously, he couldn't say that. Even though he doesn't have any ownership of the land, he's still able to be kind of the fruits, even though, of course, the trees are getting nourishment from the ground. So the question that he's posing is actually what we're saying, that at the time that the trees dry out, the owner of the land should be able to say, uproot your trees. So it says the Rashbam, Lav Dafka, this means you actually own half of the land if we're dealing with hundreds of acres and just a few trees. So maybe he's just saying, let's just see this one shot in the Rashbam, that you own, like you normally own, the small area underneath it. And therefore the Chiddush is, according to Rav Papa, he holds that whatever happens to those trees, even if they die out, the guy can still be able to replant there. Okay. All right. Vita. Pshita, and whenever it says the word pshita, it's usually not an easy Gemara. Pshita, the following case is simple. If machar karka, if let's say a person sold land, v'shir ilanais lefanav yishal karka, but he left over trees, so since he left over trees for himself, so there is going to be land for him. Says the Rashbam, Efil einun ela bays. Let's say even if all there is are two trees. If there's three trees, as we said, certainly you have a certain amount of land. However, even if all you did was leave two trees for yourself, yeshul karka k'dei mechias ilanos v'tzarchan. You still have the ability to have some of that land. The gam im yavsho yitach mim kaiman. And also, if they die out, you could plant new ones. Devadi moichel atzmo shir karka. Certainly, since he's the one who he sold it, and he's actually keeping the trees for himself, so then he's going to make sure that he's able to have this better deal. So again, if I own the land, and instead of me selling it to two people, I just sell the land to one person, but I keep a couple of trees. So not only, of course, since I kept the trees, they're my trees, but I'm also entitled to the land under there, because certainly I would have had that in mind. It says the Gemara, Rabbi Kiva. Usually when you sell generously, and therefore because of that, you would think maybe because of that, I'm getting rid of the land, but that's Hanimili Gabi Bor Vadus. That's only when it comes to a cistern, a well, that it doesn't weaken the land. Aval Ilanos, we'll go back to the Rashbam in a minute, but by trees, the Kamachachshi Ba'ara, that do deplete nutrients from the ground, Shiri Shire. Certainly, he would have left for himself the land. Dilo Shire, because if he didn't, Lamely Akar Ilana Bazil. As we said, that guy can say, oh, get rid of your trees once they dry out. So let's look at the Rashbam. So what's Rabbi Akiva? So it's actually Machlokes Rabbi Akiva and Rabbanan, which we'll see later on in Meicher Sabayas. It says as follows. So it says, Afagav the kosiv loy umka ruma the sarach likach lo derech. You need to have a special road when you sell property. Divi Rabbi Kiva, the moicher b'ayin yafa moicher. In other words, you need to include, if let's say you kept the pit for yourself, so you need to say, okay, but I also want in the stipulation of the contract that there's a little path that I can go through, because since ayin yafa moicher, typically you sell everything, and therefore if you want to be able to have a path, you have to stipulate it. Loshir b'mechiraso klum. Because the truth is, otherwise you didn't leave anything for your own self. Because when a person sells, they sell b'ayin yafa. You don't need to have a special path, because it's self-understood that that path should be for you, because the moicher b'ayin ra moicher. So therefore, certainly there should be a path for you. So it's self-understood that if I'm selling you the land, but I'm keeping this well in the middle of the field, that certainly I'm going to want a path to be able to get to it. And therefore I don't need to stipulate it, because it's ba'ayin ra moicher. So that's the machlokas Rabbi Kiva and the Tanakama. V'loshir al atzmo derech lelechas el boyroi. Okay. So he said the only time we say this is dafka when it comes to like a pit, that there's a machlokas. Last line. Ta'enu maziku klal. Having a little path or not a path to the well, then itself doesn't cause any damage. That's the reason why he doesn't think that he should hold any land for himself. So therefore, if he didn't stipulate it, he'd actually have to pay him some money in order to be able to have this little path, because he sold everything. So now he says, oh, I actually need a path, so I have to pay you a few dollars to be able to have that path. The reason why this whole machlokas is because there's really a pit, doesn't cause any damage to the ground, and therefore, when a person would have sold this, he would have sold it b'ayin yaf, according to the Chachamim, according to Rabbi Kiva. However, when it comes to these trees, that the roots are going to actually possibly damage the ground, and also while this man who just bought this land is plowing, the roots could somehow affect his blade. So therefore, because of that, says the Rashbam, Vadi asika daita l'sharu atzmo karka savivos ailanos. He certainly would have had the intention to have kept the land around the trees. Kadeshal yochel halokecha ara lavalemer kashevel ilanos akar ilancha shakavazil. So in order to prevent in the future that one day the new owner of this land will say, you know what, your trees are all dried up, get out of here, I'm not letting you replant. So therefore, even according to Rabbi Kiva, who normally says, b'ayin yafa moicher, that you sell everything, here you wouldn't have sold the land underneath the trees. Okay, because the Eloi Shire Lemalei Akar Ilana Mazil. Okay. So by the way, that case is pshita. That's the simple part. However, Machar Ilana is Mishir Karkalafana Potan Rabbi Kiva Rabbanon. Let's say it was the other way around. That you sold someone the trees, but you kept the land. Now the question is, what's the status in that case of the land underneath these trees? Because in this case, you own the land still. All you're doing is letting someone else buy the trees. So do you sell the trees b'ayin yafa and also give the person the land underneath or not? So Rabbi Kiva b'ayin yafa moicher islay, that new owner of the trees has the land underneath it. Rabbanan leislay. According to the Rabbanan, they would not have rights to it. Okay, let's just keep going. So Rabbi Kiva islay. Now, according to Rabbi Kiva, he says that the owner of, again, you own everything, and all you did was sell this guy trees. So according to Rabbi Kiva, b'ayin yafa moicher, so that owner of the trees has rights to the land underneath it. So Rabbi Kiva islay. Yafilu Rav Zvid, even according to Rav Zvid. Rav Zvid says, again, let's remind ourselves. Rav Zvid said that the case of if I sold everything, but I sold one person the trees and the other one the land, and I don't own anything now anyway, so According to Razvid, he said that the owner of the trees gets nothing, does not get the land underneath it. So Rabbi Kiva Islay, I feel Razvid the Yomer Ein Lo, that he said no, that the owner of the trees did not get anything. That's only because I sold it to two buyers. I don't own it anymore. So I sold part of it to you, the land, and part of it to you, the trees. The Armule, you can say, each, again, he could have the taina, I have no right to your trees, you have no right to my land. But over here, where the person kept the land for himself and he only sold the trees, according to Rabbi Kiva, he would have said, no, you can keep the land underneath. And the Rabbanon Leisle, according to the Rabbanon, the owner of the trees does not have the right underneath the land. Even according to Rav Papa, again the same case, which Rav Papa disagreed with Razvid, who said that if I sold it to two different people, I sold the trees and one to the land, that the owner of the trees does have some right of the land, or chatzi karka, as he said. Only by shnei lukuchos does the owner of the tree have some rights to the land. Just like he sold to me. He sold to you b'ayin yafa. He sold to you the land, probably generously. So also when he sold me the trees, he sold it to me generously, which means I should have the rights to the land underneath the trees. But over here, since he's holding on to the land himself, so maybe he's not so generous, and he's not going to allow the owner of the trees to own the land underneath. Okay. All right, so now let's look at question 6. Okay, question 6. Person sold two trees, okay, not 3. V'shir karka lefanav, and he left land. Mocher karka, he sold land. V'shayir shnei lanos lefanav. Yimish l'bali lanos karka. So it's not such an easy question. So that's basically what we just said. So machar yilanois, if he sold trees and he kept the land, we just saw that's a machlokas Rabbi Kiva Rabbanan, whether or not ba'ayin yafa moich or not. However, machar karka, if he sold the trees and he sold rather the land, but he kept them for himself, right? He kept the trees for himself. So in that situation, certainly since he's retaining ownership of the trees, even according to Rabbi Kiva, he will say that you have rights to the land underneath. Okay, so that was question 6. Okay, let's see if there's another question over here. Okay, weiter. So, Amri Nahardoi. So Nahardoi say, Achan Ritzufin Eno Chazaka. So if you ate Ritzufin seemingly consecutively, that's not a chazaka. Says the Rashbam, Lahani shloishim ilonais, regarding these 30 trees, Gagain, Shinituin Tesva Bebesa. You planted 15 in a Besa, even though you're supposed to plant 10, instead you planted more, Eno chazaka. V'yafil achon kulon kol sholoshanim. Even if you ate all of them, the lo aksek kanamaksi inchi, the in ruin lakayim el akol sharish. This is not the normal way a person would plant, because there are too many of them. It's just going to destroy the land by planting 15 trees in a base saw. Maska v'ra papa el miata hai mishra de aspasta my kanilo. When it comes to this aspasta, Rashi says an arugad aspasta. This row of aspasta. How could you be kaina in this situation? Says the Rashbam, hari zarua ritzufa. This is exactly how people plant. Your answer is el omer rabba machran ritzufim enu karka. What it really means is that if you would sell it in this way, enu karka. Says the Rashbam, again, you planted too many trees. Normally, if you purchase 3 trees, you own the land underneath it. However, the this is not a normal situation. that only applies when a person plants trees in a way that indicates that it's a stay elon, that it's going to be a field in which those trees will remain. Therefore, you'll have ownership of the land underneath it. However, in this situation, because you crammed all those trees together, so therefore, because of that, machar ritzuvim ein lo karka, because again, that's clear that it's not a state elon, but rather it's going to be just a place where the trees will grow for a short amount of time and they'll have to be uprooted. So therefore you do not have rights to the land in that case. Omerav, let's just see a few more lines. Omerav zera kitanoi. Actually, it's a malchokas tanoim. Kerem shehu natua pachas mi arba amos. Let's say you have a vineyard which was planted less than 4 amos, says the Rashbam. She'ein bein shur shur el gimel amos. Between each row, you only had 3. So enu kerem. That's not considered. Rabbi Shimon Omer enu kerem. V'cham Omer is a kerem. So it's a malchokas whether that's a vineyard. So according to the shita of Rabbi Shimon, that's not a vineyard. And he says maybe zero l'sham enu loike. If you put seeds there, you'll get malchus mishum loy sizur karmacha kilayim umaturn bachila, because it's not considered halachically like a kerem. There's no iser kilayim that you're going to get malchus for it. However, according to the shita chachamim, even though you did plant it like ritzufim too close to another, it doesn't lose its status of a kerem. It's still considered to be a kerem, and therefore we're equating it to having a state elon where there's too many trees crammed in. Is that still halachically like a state elon? So he says, "V'roin esem soyin kilo einon." What we do is we envision the middle row, because if it's, let's say each one is 3, they should be 4 apart. So let's imagine that the row in between isn't there. So therefore, it's ki'ilu, like actually you do have this distance between them. You do have a distance of 4 amos between them, or 6 actually in that situation. Says the Rashbam, "He'em soyim shura ben shtei shuros run kil ena." It's as though they're not there. They have the lushesh amos ben shuros. You're not 6. No el nami gabi marchan ritzufim l'rabanan. Also, if let's say you crammed 15 trees, roin esem soyim kil enan. The trees that are too close to another, we envision that they're not there. V'dinin k'mafuzarim v'gabi marchan ritzufim yeshul karka. And therefore, the person should still be able to have rights to the land underneath those trees. Rav Shimon ein lo karka, v'anu kitanoi de milsa. And this is how we're making this comparison one to the next. Okay, we're going to stop there, but let's see a couple more questions. Question 7. My nafkamina b'malchokas Rav Shimon Rabbanan bi'lonois hanetuyim ritzufim. If the trees are too close together, right? They're too crammed together. So in that situation, im roinas hem soyim ki'ilu einam. Do we envision like those trees don't exist, the ones that are too close, as mefuzarim kedinam, or the kul command the oimdin leikar kaimo, that we look at them the way that they are. The havile kamo she'enoi she'en kan netios klal. So one nafkamina is when it comes to a state elon, if the loikeach im yesh loikeach karka, because if they're so close together, it's not really considered to make a state elon, and therefore the person doesn't have rights to the land underneath those trees. Also, a nafkamina when it comes to a kerem, if a person would put seeds there, whether or not you're going to get malchus for kilayim or the isser of eating, which is also asur, is an isser hana there too. Question TA21. TA21. How is it possible that even if you planted 3 trees, you're not going to be entitled to any land? So the answer is just push it that if it was, so what's the question again? That machar gimli lanais. So if it was ritzufin. So if it was machar and ritzufin, ein lo karka. So that's the answer. Is a little bit of a simple answer, but I got that one wrong actually, because I was a little confused what this question was. But the fact that they were so close to one another, therefore that's the reason why it did not work. Okay, question TB23. We'll see you in tomorrow's daf. Adkam.